Eric, you're a muscle building expert, and you've recently delved deep into the stretching data for hypertrophy. I've got a few questions for you today about stretching and building muscle. But as I understand it, you've also done some stretching yourself for hypertrophy. Before we get into your own experience with stretching for building muscle, I want to ask you, does stretching build muscle?
Yes.
Expand.
So, but it requires specific criteria be met. So if you were to ask me this question, let's say 5 years ago, I would probably say no. And the reason being is that we had a tremendous amount of animal data that supported pretty ridiculous hypertrophy in response to pretty extreme stretching protocols. But it was the rare study that observed any hypertrophy in response to stretching in humans, and the vast majority of studies actually finding no change in terms of hypertrophy in response to stretching. But the devil is in the details here, because the human research up to a few years back was on relatively short duration, low intensity stretching, while the animal data is on like weighting the wings of quails and chickens for, not talking minutes, not even talking hours. We're often talking days or even weeks, or in some cases like a month at a time. We're using a stretching apparatus that put the animal in a constant stretch. So this is, a little bit of a trigger warning if you're an animal lover, which it is hard for me to read these studies. There's mostly in avian models, so in quails and chickens, but some data in, say, rabbits and some other in actual mammals. So that data indicates ridiculous increases in hypertrophy. We're talking increases in not only muscle thickness, cross-sectional area, but also fiber number, so observing hyperplasia, that are pretty large. Now, all this data was really kind of emphasized and came to light in what I'm pretty sure is the doctoral work of one Konstantin Warnecke, which is a German researcher, and his research group has really looked at this. And the reason why they looked at the animal data and actually did a meta-analysis looking at the animal stretching models is he was interested in seeing if this applied to humans. And the clear thing was that it required a high intensity and high duration and high frequency of stretching. So some of his earliest work was seeing what level of stretch tolerance is reasonable that people would undergo. And he actually compared 2 hours of daily stretching continuously to 1 hour, found, at least in the measurements they looked at, that was primarily strength for this study, similar outcomes, but a lot fewer people were willing to do 2 hours. So the research that we're going to talk about is primarily based upon daily stretching for a full hour at a pretty high perceived intensity.
Gotcha. Before we move on into stretch-mediated hypertrophy and all that entails, what is stretching and how does it differ from lifting weights?
Yeah, that seems like a ridiculous simple question, but I think it's actually a little more complex, specifically because some people are dismissing the idea of any potential for stretching being a useful approach to hypertrophy or potentially complementary, because they feel like it's producing the same mechanistic basis of hypertrophy. Both are mechanical tension. So what the heck is stretching? The idea is that we're actually trying to increase the distance between the origin and insertion of a given muscle. So we're taking the muscle tendon unit to as close to the end range physiologically that it can get and holding it there. Now, when we look at data on stretching, there's mixed research as to what is causing the very similar outcome that's consistently observed, which is an increase in joint range of motion. Some studies historically on stretching, we're talking like the studies by Beam and colleagues going back to the 90s and the 2000s, will report there's actually just an increase in stretch tolerance. Essentially, people are more comfortable being uncomfortable and can therefore achieve an increase in range of motion. But others are actually observing a change in length in the muscle tendon unit. And we don't have the data in humans to describe what is actually going on at the smallest level. Are we actually seeing an increase in sarcomeres and series? Or is it just that the sarcomeres themselves can achieve a longer length, essentially? But there are true morphological adaptations that happen in the more extreme stretching protocols. And then there are also just the ability to reach a longer muscle length in people. And there are probably tendinous adaptations as well, but that's harder to study. So I think it's important to note that lifting is also stretching. And in fact, when we look at the data on lifting, we do see increases in range of motion. If you train with a full range of motion, think about it. You're moving to your functional end range of motion for a given joint, for a given movement, and loading it. So yes, you should expect increases in range of motion from doing heavy resistance training through a full range of motion. But you generally see greater increases in range of motion from purposeful stretching protocols. And in fact, in one study that we'll talk about later, two studies, one in the calves, one in the pecs, where they compared a extreme stretching protocol to a resistance training protocol, the data trended or was significantly greater in the stretching group for increasing range of motion.
Earlier you mentioned extreme hypertrophy in animal studies. Does stretching build more muscle than lifting?
It's tough because we don't have a lot of resistance training studies in animals. So it could theoretically, if we could do things that we did to animals and call it ethical, or that people would be willing to do it. But we don't know.
What about in humans? In humans, does stretching build more muscle than lifting?
To the data we have at this point, the answer would probably be not, and it seems to be far less time efficient. So we have two different studies that directly compare stretching protocols head-to-head with resistance training. There was one by Warneke and colleagues in the calves where they compared 3 times per week doing 5 sets of 15, or I think 10 to 15 reps to failure, but at a hypertrophy rep range to failure of calf raises. So it took them about 45 minutes per week to do it. Compared to daily 1 hour stretching in an orthotic device. So basically sitting there with a calf stretching boot that would take your leg into near maximal dorsiflexion, 8 out of 10 discomfort on a stretching scale of pain, holding that for an hour per day and adjusting it so you stay at 8 for 8 weeks. Similar changes in muscle thickness, as well as strength, intriguingly enough, in the calves from doing the stretching boot or doing calf raises. Wolin and colleagues did a different protocol. They had a self-ratcheting stretching device for the pecs. So you'd lie on your back, feet up against the wall, knees bent so you can't arch your lower back, and you have straps around your elbows. You're at like a 90-90 position of external rotation, abduction, and elbow flexion, and you'd have these straps pulled and attached to a load cell. And every time your pecs would relax and you'd see some change, they would self-ratchet and hold you. And the initial point that these participants got in was not 8 out of 10, but 10 out of 10. The caveat, though, is instead of doing an hour per day, they did 15 minutes 4 times per week. So these would be 15 minutes of hell, truly, if you think about what it is to be at the maximal stretch tolerance you can hold, and to every time your body loosen up a little bit to get stuck into an even longer position. So it's kind of like the high-intensity stretching versus the high-volume stretching camps, if you will. But both of them, for different reasons, would be incredibly uncomfortable. I've done the former. I've worn an orthotic boot, stretched my calves for an hour, not 7 days per week, 6 days per week. I took 1 day off just because I'm just not that hardcore. But I have not done the self-ratcheting 15 minutes of max exertion 4 times per week. But in both of those studies, it produced similar changes in hypertrophy in the pecs and the calves to doing 3 times per week training. And this group, they did 3 sets, I believe, 3 sets 3 times per week of chest flies. So I might have the sets wrong, but essentially what we were looking at was half an hour of pec training per week versus 45 minutes of extreme stretching versus 7 hours compared to 45 minutes and similar outcomes. So it's tough to know if they maxed out what they could have got from their calves from the stretching protocol or not, but it might be that you can accommodate for having a shorter duration by having a higher intensity of stretch, like we observed in the pec stretching study. What's
your own experience been with the calf orthotic device? Did you experience growth using stretching, if you can speak to the results?
It did. So what we did specifically was, instead of using a unilateral within participant design, because it was a case study of myself, and I was unwilling to just stretch one of my calves because I'm a crazy bodybuilder, I wanted to stretch both. We used a baseline period of 4 weeks long while I was training calves and not stretching to see what my normal trajectory of growth and what my typical error of measurement was on an ultrasound muscle thickness measurement in my triceps surae, or my overall calf size. And we used that for whether there was a real change. And then I stretched both calves in the orthotic boot, 8 out of 10, 1 hour per calf. So it's 2 hours per day, 6 days per week on top of my resistance training for the calves. And then after the 12 weeks of training, we took a week where I did not stretch and then looked at the post measurement to see how much that might have been swelling while I maintained a lower calf training protocol. So basically, we tried to answer the question of, could you take an advanced level bodybuilder who'd been purposely trying to build as much calf muscle as possible, add stretching on top of that, and would they get anything out of it? Is it potentially complementary? And I'll say preliminarily, we did see a significant increase in muscle thickness. It also matched my observations that I thought I saw my calves improving during this period. Now, that's all good and fun, but this was not good and fun. In fact, I'd say it was good as far as the outcome, but man, it was extremely painful. What I would experience would be like pins and needles and discomfort and trying to jump out of my body about 20 minutes in, and then going, sweet, third of the way there. And the beauty of it that you have to stay out of an 8 out of 10 discomfort is that while it would get better if you just held the same distance, every time it started to get better, I had to then tighten the boot more. So it stayed this way for 12 weeks. It was incredibly painful. I got a little bit better at being tolerant of the pins and needles, but my calf would go numb and then it would just kind of burn everywhere. But it seemed to work. So yeah, I mean, shout out to all the participants in these studies because now I know what you experienced. Was this time efficient? Absolutely not. Was it worth it? Maybe. Am I still doing this? No. Now, there was one other interesting finding, which I thought was really cool that Warnke did. They compared men and women. Now, I don't think this is a true sex difference, but more correlated with sex. They observed greater increases in hypertrophy of the calves in men than women, but they also reported higher baseline flexibility in women, which is something that is seen in many other studies. And the idea here is based upon the proposed mechanism that being in a stretch produces higher degrees of tension. If you are more flexible, you may not be able to produce the same level of tension because you already have that flexibility. Now, importantly, the women still did significantly grow from stretching, just not to the same degree as men. So my suspicion is that the more flexible you are, the more you'll get out of a stretching, the more inflexible you are, the more you will get out of a stretching protocol. And if you can maintain that flexibility while still performing high tension stretching, whether through resistance training or actual stretching, you'll probably maintain the gains. So something that I've very intentionally done after I did that stretching protocol is I do pause at the bottom of calf raises. I make sure I get as long into dorsiflexion as I can. At the end of sets, I pause there, and I do occasionally stretch maybe once every 2 weeks, just static hold 10, 15 minutes to try to keep the range of motion gains I had. And I can tell you more obviously than any increase in strength or hypertrophy, my dorsiflexion range increased dramatically from doing this. And I still have most of that, maybe 90% of that dorsiflexion increase.
So stretching makes you more flexible. And
unsurprisingly.
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
And true stretch-mediated hypertrophy can seem to occur in humans. Do you think that's what we're seeing with lengthened training?
I don't. And the reason being is when you look at the actual time courses required to produce hypertrophy, they don't compare. So like if you're doing, say, like if we look at some of the studies, like if you look at the amount of time spent in a truly stretched position in, say, Cassiano and colleagues, it's a fraction of the time compared to Warnke that they were able to produce not doing lengthened bias training in the comparator group, you know. So I think it is probably part of the adaptation that's going on, but I would suspect that the actual stretch stimulus is a minor part of what's going on with, say, more lengthened training. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's another reason why we shouldn't be dismissing stretch-mediated hypertrophy as something that is potentially complementary to resistance training. Some of the hot takes on the internet that I don't agree with is, one, stretch-mediated hypertrophy only produces increases in hypertrophy through sarcomeres in series. If we just think about this from a physics perspective, if we were only seeing sarcomeres in series increase, we wouldn't see the kind of changes in muscle thickness that we're observing in humans that are comparable to doing resistance training. So that's one. Two, when we look at animal models, huge increases in cross-sectional area, which again should not be happening if it's just sarcomeres in series. Okay, so that's notch against that idea, number uno, okay? The second critique that you'll see is, you know what? The whole proposed mechanism of stretch-induced hypertrophy is just mechanical tension. So why would it be any different than hypertrophy training? It would be redundant. We don't need to do it. You get a stretch from hypertrophy training anyway. Now, I'll admit this could be true. This could be true. But to paint the broad brushstroke of mechanical tension is all the same really is not respecting the complexity of skeletal muscle architecture and the number of ways that mechanical tension can be sensed and the lack of understanding at the molecular level that we have of how hypertrophy actually occurs. So I'm aware of at least 5 mechanosensors that respond to different types of mechanical tension, and we still haven't even necessarily linked each one of those mechanosensors to anabolic pathways which stimulate hypertrophy, but we think they are. So some of the common ones people talk about with far too much confidence compared to the data we have are one, titin. Right? So this is attaching the myosin-actin chain to the ultrastructure, and when you're doing an eccentric contraction, it unfolds and there's probably a signaling cascade. Okay? So it makes sense that it would probably be stimulated by a stretch as well as contraction. Another one are what's called costomeres or focal adhesions. And these are what help us generate lateral force transmission and also act as sensors, and they probably respond more to contraction rather than stretching. But those are the 2 that most people know about, but there's others. In fact, I think this is wild and really cool just to demonstrate one of them. The actual nuclei in muscles themselves, nuclear flattening, may produce an anabolic response. And when you stretch a muscle, those nuclei are getting flattened as well. But there's also membranes that are changed in response to stretch, opening calcium channels that could have a potential impact, and more. There are things that are beyond my expertise because I'm not a muscle physiologist. I think there's a couple of different protein complexes I had never heard of until I dug into this, and I'm like, oh, what's that? Yeah. You know, so we're still just barely uncovering the actual process of mechanotransduction, and there is good reason to believe that mechanotransduction is different when you're doing a long duration, high intensity stretch than simply moving from concentric to eccentric and having some, pause at best in the lengthened position. So I don't think we can say that they're necessarily the exact same stimulus. Another thing that Warnke proposes in some of their papers, and what I experienced through that pins and needles, is that when you are in that really stretched position, and also you're getting this compensatory contraction from your muscle, there's an occlusion effect. So it may have some overlapping effects with blood flow restriction training. And again, hyperplasia was observed in these animals, which it's very difficult to even set up an experimental model to observe hyperplasia in humans, but generally the thought process is that traditional resistance training in humans is not producing hyperplasia. But if we're seeing robust increases, we're talking 50% increase in the number of muscle fibers in animal models, you would think that maybe something's going on here with stretching. So through all of those various mechanisms, both higher level and at the actual molecular level, potentially being different, I don't think we can rule out that stretching might be complementary to lifting. But like I said, I'm very open to the idea that they are relatively overlapping and redundant. But I don't think we can say that. I don't think we can say that only untrained individuals will respond to this. I don't think we can say that it's only sarcomeres in series, or how do we explain cross-sectional area and muscle thickness changes. And I don't think we should really write it off yet, especially with just a mechanistic rationale when we barely understand the mechanisms of what's going on. And to answer your original question, it doesn't make sense that having, 45 reps per week in a lengthened position for only maybe 10% of a rep is comparable to 7 hours per week of stretching, or even the 60 minutes that was observed in Wolin and colleagues in that extreme stretch position. I think they're fundamentally different, and that leaves the question open of what's going on here.
Yeah. So stretching causes hypertrophy.
It does.
In humans.
If it's intense enough, long enough, and frequent enough.
Should we apply this? Who should apply it? How do we apply it? Tell me the specifics and the practical applications there.
All right, so if you are a competitive bodybuilder who is crazy, go wild. If you want to actually replicate what I did, if you want to do some of these extreme stretching protocols, I would encourage you to have fun with it. You're going to struggle to be able to actually apply some of these because you don't have an orthotic device, or you don't have the self-ratcheting pec stretching device. But Wolin and colleagues did another recently published study I don't believe they actually looked at hypertrophy, but they did find strength increases from people being given guidance on their own without necessarily some type of BDSM torture device of doing extreme stretches that they hold for a similar frequency and duration per week, perceiving it to be the max stretch they can tolerate. They did see increases in strength even when done from home. So there's potential application here. Now, just because we have this new research on stretching doesn't mean we should forget the other research on stretching that's looking at more at acute performance. We know that if you do sufficient stretching to actually alter muscle tendon unit architecture acutely, it will have an acutely negative impact on strength and power performance and probably the resultant hypertrophy. So the only time I'd say you don't want to do all this extreme stretching stuff is prior to training, even with maybe a couple hours, because I can tell you this is not just the quick stretch that is observed in some of these older studies that show a negative impact on power. If you're stretching on that day, you probably don't want to train that day later. I think you need to do it either post-workout, at night, or on your off days, if you're going to do it at all, okay? That's number one. And then you can try some of these protocols. And I would say just because we got the 7 hours per week that Wernicke's done, I don't think you should go that hardcore. You probably want to ramp up into it. I do think there is some unknown level of injury risk or potential, especially when you're also doing resistance training on top of it, because we're really pushing tissue to some pretty extremes here. So I think you should be more cautious than that. I would say maybe start with 1 to 2 times per week of 15 to 20 minutes, and maybe build up to the point where you're doing something similar to Woolen of 4 times per week of 15 to 20, maybe 30 minutes. I wouldn't take it further than that in most cases. What I did, I wouldn't recommend. That's for bodybuilders. That's for people who are really trying to turn over every single stone. For everyone else, I think this is a poor return on investment. I think it's a bad proposition. It's not the best use of your time. It's logistically infeasible. It's highly uncomfortable. And it's not fun. And you're not going to like it like you like lifting. However, there are some tools which can be very useful for when you're, say, traveling, don't have access to a gym, or you're in a position like, let's say, COVID, for example, where certain muscle groups are very hard to train with what you have access to. There are some things which are really useful when you're, say, traveling. When I'm traveling and I go to an area where I know I don't have access to good gym equipment and I may not have the time to get away, I take BFR wraps with me, and now I will probably do stretching. One of the harder muscle groups to train when you're, say, traveling and don't have gym access is like your hamstrings. Mm-hmm. But it's pretty easy to stretch your hamstrings, right? I remember specifically when we were in Belarus and I was coaching Bryce Lewis at the 2017 World Championships, the only gym access I had was the training hall and sneaking in some sessions between other weight classes actually competing, which meant I could sneak in a military press, a bench, a row. You put the racks up to like I'm 7 feet super heavyweight. You do some chins with your knees bent. You can get a little bit of work in. But I also had a hip injury at the time, so I couldn't do much squats and deadlifts. So instead, I just did BFR and body weight lunges. But I didn't really have a good answer for how do I train my hamstrings. I didn't want to be like, hey, will you help me do Nordics? But I could have just sat there and done a 15-minute hardcore stretch a couple times per week for my hamstrings, and that would have been pretty effective. Same thing for my calves. So I think this is a great tool when you are going to be stuck in a hotel room and you want to still get a decent stimulus that week while you're away traveling, or maybe you, for some reason, can't get to the gym, et cetera, et cetera. And just knowing that this is a tool you can have in your tool belt, I think can be really useful in those instances where you may not have gym access.
Once or twice a week, 15 minutes, start easy, and go from there at the end of a session, at night, or in the morning, essentially just far away from a session or immediately after it, correct?
Perfect.
Quick fire round of rebuttals/questions.
Let's go.
Do only beginners benefit?
Hard to say. I would suspect that it has much more relevance to how flexible are you. And I think we have enough data that yes, while resistance training does improve range of motion, there's probably more range of motion you could get from stretching based upon head-to-head comparisons. So I would say probably not, but they might benefit a little bit more than someone who's more experienced.
Do all muscle groups benefit?
Hard to say. We have data on the pecs and the calves. I think it's very plausible that there could be some muscles which are very difficult to get into a true physiological stretch to produce that mechanical tension to have them benefit. Right now, I would say we have no reason to think that not all muscles would benefit, but it may be some muscles which are simply infeasible to put into these kind of extreme stretches. At the very least, if I want to be super conservative, I know the pecs and the calves respond well.
What about interset stretching? You didn't mention interset stretching. Do you think that plays a role, can be used?
I think it can be used, but I think there's a little more risk to it, and I think it's not necessary. We do have a fair amount of data indicating that pre-training stretching can have a negative impact on strength and power if it's done to the point where it's actually going to produce high levels of tension in the muscle tendon unit. So you'd have to think the same thing would occur in interset stretching, even though we have data on it. So it is inducing a tension stimulus, but to me it makes sense to not induce a tension stimulus when it can harm the rest of the tension stimulus you want within training. So while I'm not opposed to it, I think from a pragmatic perspective, it probably makes more sense to have it at the end of the workout, something like a DC stretch. I'm talking about dog crap training from back in the day. And that also was something that was anecdotally derived, and it was probably ahead of its time, but it made sense logically, like, oh, if I'm in the middle of a bunch of chest sets and I do this massive crazy stretch, I'm going to have to dump load, or I'm going to be maybe at greater injury risk. But if I do it at the end of the workout, it's just additional tension, and maybe a different type of tension. So I think you could do interset stretching, and indeed there is a study that might indicate some potential benefit there, but I think there is a non-negligible chance of it simply harming the total stimulus you could have. And I think probably resistance training at this stage, we have to admit, is at least as stimulative, but with a lower level of inefficiency.
Final question.
Yes, sir.
Name a few common stretches for different muscles you'd recommend. Give me 3.
Sure. So I think a sit and reach hamstring stretch is probably a really good one. I think a straight leg dorsiflexion stretch where you go up to, say, a wall, or you go up to, say, steps, and you do one calf at a time stretching it. That's probably a better one, especially if you have grippy shoes, than trying to get into the kind of the downward dog position to stretch your calves, which most people can't stay there for a long time. And then since we've also got data on the pecs, I think a 90-degree angle door stretch, where you just go into the door jamb of a door and you put your arm at 90 degrees and then you try to turn away and move forward so that you can get a good stretch across your pec. And again, all of these stretches are probably dependent upon not just the technique, but also getting to the point where you're experiencing 8 or higher out of 10 stretch discomfort and then holding it for at least 15 minutes. That's hard. So be aware that you may be all excited by watching this video. You go and try it and you're like, oh man, I don't want that smoke. It's okay. Try just 5 minutes the first time, maybe build up to it. You will get better at this. You will still hate your life, but it'll be eventually sustainable if you build up to it.
Beautiful. Eric, where can people find you?
People can find me stretching my calves, stretching my pecs, stretching my hamstrings in a hotel room because I worked past the point the gym closed every day. No, I'm just kidding. Great place to find me, 3dmusclejourney.com. That's a great one-stop shop where you can pick your level of nerding that you want, right? You can read some of our blog posts. You can go to our YouTube channel and have a little more blended kind of anecdotal science, evidence-based information. Or if you want, like, hey, I just want to read the books about all this stuff, you can go to muscleandstrengthpyramids.com, which we have a link to from 3dmusclejourney.com. Or you can take our link to the Mass Research Review, where every month we're putting out an issue covering all the latest data. And I've written probably like 7 articles about stretch-mediated hypertrophy because it's something I'm just nerding out on and very interested in. So that's a great place to go. And also, you probably want to follow me on Instagram at Helms3DMJ. Once our case study on me is published, I will absolutely be putting that out on my Instagram, talking about it, probably doing some YouTube work. So that's also a great place where you can find me promoting the fact that I was on other amazing channels like this one as a guest.
Highly, highly recommend checking out Mass Research Review. Great resource. Also highly recommend liking the video. That's it from the Strong by Science channel. We out.